Hi guys. Okay, so Miracle Worker, you'll remember that we left off when Annie had just gotten to the Keller house and Kate was introducing her to Keller, and we talked about just entering someone's world, and because Helen doesn't hear or see anything, in order to enter her world, Annie has to make herself known. So that's where we are. If you're following along in your book with me, which you should, we're gonna be on page 27, and we're in this big paragraph of stage directions, okay? I'm gonna read for about 15 minutes. There's some questions in this video that I want you to answer, and then that's it. That's your lesson for today, okay? All right, so here we go. Top of page 27. Big stage direction. Starts with Kate silences him with a hand on her arm. Ready? Okay, here we go. Kate silences him with a hand on his arm. That's Keller. When Annie finally reaches the porch steps, she stops, contemplating Helen for a last moment before entering her world. Then she drops the suitcase on the porch with intentional heaviness. Helen starts with the jar and comes to grope over to it. Annie puts forth her hand and touches Helen's. Annie puts forth her hand and touches Helen's hand. Helen at once grasps it and commences to explore it, like reading a face. She moves her hand on Annie's forearm and dress, and Annie brings her face within reach of Helen's fingers, which travel over it, quite without timidity, until they encounter and push aside the smoked glasses. Annie's gaze is grave, unpitying, very attentive. She puts her hand on Helen's arm, but Helen at once pulls away, and they confront each other with a distance between. Then Helen returns to the suitcase, tries to open it, cannot. Annie points Helen's hand overhead. Helen pulls away, tries to open the suitcase again. Annie points her head overhead again. Helen points overhead. A question. And Annie, drawing Helen's hand to her own face, nods. Helen now begins tugging the suitcase toward the door. When Annie tries to take it from her, she fights off and backs through the doorway with it. Annie stands a moment, then follows her in, and together they get the suitcase up the steps into Annie's room. Kate. Well? She's very rough, Katie. I like her, Captain. Certainly we're a particular kind of young woman in the North. How old is she? Oh, well, she's not in her teens, you know. She's only a child. What's her family like, shipping her off alone this far? I couldn't learn. She's very closed-mouthed about some things. Why does she wear those glasses? I like to see a person's eyes when I talk to... For the sun. She was blind. Blind. She had 9 operations on her eyes, one just before she left. Blind. Good heavens, do they expect one blind child to teach another? Has she experience at least? How long did she teach there? She was a pupil. Katie. This is her first position? She was valedictorian. Here's a house full of grown-ups can't cope with the child. How can an inexperienced, half-blind Yankee schoolgirl manage her? James moves in with the trunk on his shoulder. Great improvement. Now we have 2 of them to look after. You look after those strawberry plants. James stops with the trunk. Keller turns from him without another word and marches off. Nothing I say is right. Why say anything? She calls. Don't be long, Captain. We'll have supper right away. She moves into the house and through the rear door of the family room. James trudges in with the trunk, takes it up the steps to Annie's room, and sets it down outside the door. The lights elsewhere dim somewhat. Meanwhile, inside, Annie has given Helen a key. While Annie removes her bonnet, Helen unlocks and opens the suitcase. The first thing she pulls out is a voluminous shawl. She fingers it until she perceives what it is, then she wraps it around her, and acquiring Annie's bonnet and smoke glasses as well, dons the lot. The shawl swamps her, and the bonnet settles down on the glasses, but she stands before a mirror, cocking her head to one side, then to the other, in a mockery of adult action. Kind of like, how do I look today? Annie is amused, and talks to her as one might to a kitten with no trace of company manners. All the trouble I went to, and that's how I look? Helen then comes back to the suitcase, gropes for more, lifts out a pair of female drawers. Oh no, not the drawers. Drawers are underwear, so she's like pulling out underclothes, and that's not super good. But Helen discards them, then comes to the doll. Her fingers explore its features, and when she raises it and finds its eyes open and closed, she's at first startled, then delighted. She picks it up, taps its head vigorously, taps her own chest, and nods questioningly. Annie takes her finger, points it at the doll, points it at Helen, touching it to her own face, then nods. Helen sits back on her heels, clamps the doll to herself and rocks it. Annie studies her, still in bonnet and smoked glasses like a caricature of herself, and addresses her humorously. All right, Miss O'Sullivan, let's begin with doll. She takes Helen's hand, and in her palm, Annie's fingers points, thumb holding her other fingers clenched. So like this. D. O. L. L. Doll. You spell pretty well. Annie's one hurried move gets the drawer swiftly back into the suitcase, the lid banged shut, and her head's turned to see James leaning in the doorway. Finding out if she's ticklish? She is. Annie regards him stonily, but Helen, after a scowling moment, tugs at her hand again, imperious. Annie repeats the letters, and Helen interrupts her fingers in the middle, feeling each of them, puzzled. Annie touches Helen's hand to the doll and begins to spell again. What is it? A game? An alphabet. An alphabet for the deaf. Helen now repeats the fingers' movements in air exactly, her head cocked to her own hand, and Annie's eyes suddenly gleam. Oh, how bright she is! You think she knows what she's doing? He takes Helen's hand to throw a meaningless gesture into it. She repeats this one too. She imitates everything. She's a monkey. Yes, she's a bright little monkey, all right. She takes the doll from Helen and reaches for her hand. Helen instantly grabs the doll back, and he takes it again, and Helen's hand next, but Helen is incensed now. When Annie draws her hand to her face to shake her head no and tries to spell to her, Helen slaps at Annie's face. Annie grasps Helen by both arms, swinging her into a chair, holding her, pinned there, kicking, while glasses, doll, bonnet fly in various directions. James laughs. She wants her doll back. When she spells it. Spell? She doesn't even know the thing has a name even. Of course not. Who expects her to now? All I want is for her fingers to learn the letters. Won't mean anything to her. Annie gives him a look. She then tries to form Helen's fingers into the letters, but Helen swings a haymaker instead, which Annie barely ducks, at once pinning her down again. Doesn't like that alphabet, Miss Sullivan. You invent it yourself? Helen is now in a rage, fighting tooth and nail to get out of the chair, and Annie answers while struggling and dodging her kicks. Spanish monks under a vow of silence, which I wish you'd take. And suddenly releasing Helen's hands, she comes and shuts the door in James' face. Helen drops to the floor, groping around for the doll. Annie looks around desperately, sees her purse on the bed, rummages in it, and comes up with a battered piece of cake wrapped in newspaper. With her foot, she moves the doll deftly out of the way of Helen's groping, and going on her knees, she lets Helen smell the cake. When Helen grabs for it, Kate removes the cake and quickly spells into each hand. Cake. From Washington up north, it's the best I can do. Helen's hands waits, baffled, and repeats it. C-A-K-E. What my fingers do. Never mind what it means. She touches the cake briefly to Helen's nose, pats her hand, presents her own hand. Helen spells the letters rapidly back. Annie pats her hand enthusiastically, then gives her the cake. Helen crams it into her mouth with both hands. Annie watches her with humor. Get it down fast, maybe I'll steal that back too. Now, she takes the doll, touches it to Helen's nose, and spells again into the hand. D-O-L-L. Think it over. Helen thinks it over while Annie presents her own hand. Then Helen spells 3 letters. Annie waits a second, then completes the word for Helen in her palm. L. She hands over the doll, and Helen gets a good grip on its leg. Imitate now, understand later. End of the lesson. She never finishes, because Helen swings the doll with a furious energy. It hits Annie squarely in the face, and she falls back with a cry of pain, her knuckles up to her mouth. Helen waits, tensed for further combat. When Annie lowers her knuckles, she looks at blood on them. She works her lips, gets to her feet, finds the mirror, and bares her teeth at herself. Now she is furious herself. You little wretch. No one taught you any manners? But rounding from the mirror, she sees the door slam. Helen and the doll are on the outside, and Helen is turning the key in the lock. Annie darts over to pull the knob. The door is locked fast. She yanks it again. Helen, Helen, let me out of... She bats her brow at the folly of speaking. Because Helen's deaf and she can't hear, let me out of here. But James, now downstairs, hears her and turns to see Helen with the key and doll groping her way down the steps. James takes in the whole situation, makes a move to intercept Helen, but then changes his mind, lets her pass, and amusedly follows her out onto the porch. Upstairs, Annie, meanwhile, rattles the knob, kneels, peers through the keyhole, gets up. She goes to the window, looks down, frowns. James, from the yard, singing gaily up at her, "Buffalo girl, are you coming out tonight? Coming out tonight, coming out." He drifts back into the house. Annie takes a handkerchief, nurses her mouth, stands in the middle of the room, staring at the door and window in turn. She catches sight of herself in the mirror, her cheeks scratched, her hair disheveled, her handkerchief bloody, her face disgusted with herself. She addresses the mirror with some irony. "Don't worry. They'll find you. You're not lost. Only out of place."